New research from Boston Consulting Group highlights connectivity as a critical enabler in achieving the ambitions of a nation to grow its digital economies. At the core is what's called spectrum. Faisal Hamady is principal consultant at BCG. He's with us here in the studio to tell us more about the latest report. Faisal, first up, can I just ask you, what is meant by spectrum?
Sure. So spectrum, or radio spectrum as we call it, is kind of the range of frequencies that are harnessed as radio signals for the use in wireless communication. At the lower end of this spectrum is the radio frequency, which we would be focusing on more. And then as you go up in frequencies, there would be things like the infrared, the visible light, the X-rays. It's a natural and scarce resource that's harmonized at an international level, but it's really managed within each country. You don't see it in your day-to-day, but it enables the TV broadcasting, it enables mobile, GPS, and a whole bunch of applications.
Do you think that the current infrastructure is capable of dealing with the connectivity that currently exists and the connectivity that's going to be needed in the future?
So there is two dimensions of this infrastructure. One is kind of the actual technology deployed, and another one is kind of the spectrum infrastructure that's being put behind it. And it would vary depending on the application that you're looking at. So some of this is kind of satisfying the needs of the requirements, but other ones are basically lagging behind what's needed. If you look into the shifting consumer demands, in terms of like digital mobile, in terms of like the enterprise demands as well, in terms of the digital transformations, there's a plethora of applications that are going to be using more and more of the connectivity of the demand, and they would have a different requirement in terms of latency, in terms of reliability, in terms of like the density of the networks. So really an action needs to be taken there in the first place. Why
do you think spectrum should and is of so much national interest to countries around the world?
Spectrum has a high potential in terms of socioeconomic impact and benefits. In our study that you've mentioned, we highlight that in the top 20 ICT nations, spectrum enables more than 3.4% of their GDP. If you reflect on that compared to the UAE, for example, with the baseline, we are talking about 1% of the GDP to be further enabled. That's $4 to $5 billion of GDP on an annual basis.
What kind of technology is this going to produce in the future? If we look into a crystal ball in 10 years ahead, how is it going to change?
So there are multiple vectors of growth within the technology that are emerging, and we think they're going to have a profound impact in the next decade. You think of certain use cases, for example, of short-range devices or IoT deployments, also real-time mixed reality streaming. These are going to change the way we look into healthcare, we look into the smart homes, we look into the smart cities, and so on. There's another vector of new technologies that are coming to play. So if you look into the drones, or you look into the HAPS, the high altitude platform systems, such as the bigger balloons or the drones that provide connectivity, these are kind of new elements coming into play. And they're used already with the Facebooks and the Googles of the world. And now there's also a whole bunch of new connectivity constellations. If you think about massive IoT deployments in agricultural monitoring, if you think about a few of the companies that are launching thousands of satellites into the space, these are mega constellations. If you think even recently we've had a discussion on the UAE about launching private 5G networks for the industry verticals, for the ports, for the airports, and so on. There's a changing demand at a very fast pace in terms of the shape and form, and that would be kind of the main challenge facing the regulators and the market in the future, this heterogeneity of the network.
Brilliant. We appreciate you coming in and joining us tonight. Faisal Hamady, thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.